Let's talk about attributions. Attributions are things that we point to as the reason or the cause for various events or behaviors. So, if you have to sum it up in one word, think of it as like explanations. Okay, attributions would be explanations. You're trying to explain either somebody else's behavior or maybe your own behavior. So, attributions, that's what we're looking at. And there's a difference between what we call internal and external attributions. Internal attributions is explaining behavior based on the internal characteristics of that person. For example, I got a bad grade on my chemistry test because I'm just not very smart. That's an internal attribution. Or, in other words, it's based on my disposition. It's based on a characteristic or a personality trait that I possess. Okay? And so it's consistent. It's something that it's part of being me. Okay? That's an internal attribution. An external attribution is explaining behavior based on the situation. For example, I failed my chemistry test because it was right after prom and I just didn't have time to study. So, in other words, that's not saying anything necessarily about me. It's just saying, hey, the reason or the explanation for me failing was the situation. In other words, if the test had been some other time, I would have been okay. So, internal and external attributions. Internal is based on the person's disposition or personality traits. External is based on the situation or the environment. Now, we don't always make the correct assumption, or we're not always totally accurate when we talk about attributions and we try and explain behavior, whether it be ours or somebody else. Now, let's talk about some common mistakes that people make when they attribute behavior. The fundamental attribution error, that's the most common error that there is. That fundamental, the most basic problem in terms or error in terms of attribution. It's the tendency to focus on a person's internal personality traits, in other words, on their disposition, and ignore the situational influences. So, fundamental attribution error is the idea that we're trying to explain somebody else's behavior, and when we do that, we very often will focus on their internal or dispositional traits, and we tend to ignore the situation. Years ago, when Michael Jordan was still playing basketball, Michael Jordan, I think most people would say Michael Jordan is, if not the greatest basketball player in the history of basketball, he's definitely, in the top 5, okay, without a doubt. So I was walking around my classroom several years back when Michael Jordan was still playing basketball, and I heard a conversation amongst 3 or 4 of my students, and it wasn't really on topic. We were not covering Michael Jordan in class that day, but their little group was. And I overheard them talking about Michael Jordan and how good he was at basketball. And one student in the group made the statement. I heard him. He said, well, the only reason Michael Jordan is so good is because he's black. He made that statement, and my jaw hit the ground. I could not believe that he said that. Now, what he's doing is he's attributing the greatness of Michael Jordan. He's attributing how good he was as a basketball player to the simple fact that part of his personality trait, he happened to be a black man. Now, I think it's easy to see that that's incorrect. If his logic, if this gentleman's logic was accurate, then that would mean we would have thousands or millions of Michael Jordans, because there's a lot of other black individuals in society. So, in other words, they should be just as good as Michael Jordan because they're black. Well, we know that's not true. The fact of the matter is, Michael Jordan, when you watched his work ethic, He worked as hard or harder than any other individual in the game. He practiced relentlessly. And that's why he was so good. It had nothing to do with his skin color. But that one gentleman was making that statement. That was an example of the fundamental attribution error. Now, let's take another look at a different type of error that a lot of people make. And this is when they're explaining their own behavior. Okay, this is explaining your own behavior. And it's called the self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is people's tendency to attribute your successes to internal factors, while you attribute your failures to external or situational factors. If you think about it, basically this helps to protect our ego. Okay? So, for example, okay, I got an A on my math test because, doggone it, I'm just smart. But I failed, my chemistry class because the teacher is just horrible. He or she never covers the material, and everybody's failing that class. So you see the difference, okay? When I succeeded, it was because of me, something good about me. But when I failed, it was somebody or something else that caused it. That's called the self-serving bias. Now, note the differences here. Fundamental attribution error is when you're trying to attribute somebody else's behavior. Self-serving bias is when you're trying to explain your own behavior. Now, does this ever actually affect us in terms of, treating other people or affecting our behavior in some way? And yes, it does, without a doubt. Okay, take for example, if you're you're driving behind a car and the car is kind of weaving back and forth on the street, or it's doing some stuff that, normal drivers don't do. Now, if you look at it and you attribute that person's driving skills to the situation, you may come to the conclusion that that driver must be sick. There must be something wrong. They're having issues with something. So either something's wrong with the car, or the driver's sick, or something's happening to cause that driver to behave the way they are. And you may follow them, and you may even pull up next to them at a stoplight and roll down the window and say, "Hey, are you okay? Is everything all right?" Now, on the other hand, if you do what a lot of people do and you ignore the situation and you focus on their disposition, this would be the fundamental attribution error again. You may just look and say, "What a stupid driver. This guy doesn't know what he's doing." And so as you speed up and fly on by, you may give that person a dirty look, or, maybe some unkind gesture. Not a good deal, okay? Not a good thing to do, by the way. But that, you notice your behavior has changed dramatically in those two situations, simply because of the way you are explaining or attributing the other person's behavior. So, attributions can definitely impact a person's behavior.